Recording has begun. All right, so 2 topics for today's study hall. Those are going to be boldface problems in critical reasoning, followed by the 7-step method for rate, time, distance. And what I mean by "and friends" here is that the problems we're going to look at today are all actually rate, time, and distance, but these methods work just as well for problems of various and assorted other types that follow the same sort of principle. So what we're going to do when we look at rate, time, distance is we're going to examine the other types of problems for which you can also use this. The 7-step method, by the way, it's not in contradiction to anything in the strategy guide. It's more like a supplement to the methods that we use in our strategy guide. So it builds on and makes it, well, what this 7-step method is, it's a little bit more formal than the methods that are in our strategy guide. And so I know that a lot of students appreciate having an approach that is a little bit more formal. In any case, though, what we're going to do first is we're going to go ahead and get started with the critical reasoning boldface type problems. So let's go ahead and kick that off. So those of you who are scared of the baby owls, they are now gone. Okay, so what I want to talk about here at first is the basic idea behind these critical reasoning boldface problems. So these are the ones where, let me get this typed on the screen here. Okay, CR boldface problems. These are the ones where you know how it works. We'll look at some examples in a second. These are the problems on which you have a passage, a longer passage, and then at least one, but usually 2 statements are in boldface. And then you are asked for the role played by those statements in the passage. And then you have all kinds of sort of cryptic statements about that. What we're going to look at today is a 2-tiered method for approaching these kinds of problems, where there's a vast difference in scope between the 2 tiers, but the 2-tiered approach. The first approach, which is the ideal, but is a little bit out of reach on some of these problems for a lot of students, is to diagram the argument either mentally or on paper. We'll talk about how that works in a little bit, and then actually try to predict the actual answer to the question. Because unlike a lot of other critical reasoning problems, you don't really have to have answer choices for these. If you understand the argument fully, you should have an idea of the role played by these things without having to be prompted. But that's difficult, and so the main theme of today in critical reasoning is going to be a backup method. As a backup, you can classify the statements. And we'll see what we mean by that in a little bit. But there are ways that even if you don't, the disadvantage of this method, it's a backup method for a reason. The disadvantage is that it may not get you down to one answer choice. But an advantage of this backup method that we're going to look at is you can employ this method even if you totally don't understand the argument, which is kind of nice. You still have to be able to classify statements according to a certain rubric of fact versus claim, which we'll look at in a second. But it's a lot easier than having to actually understand the flow of the argument, which in many cases is sort of cryptic. So let's go ahead and get started. The ideal approach is this. you want to understand the flow of the logic in the argument. So what can help here is to try to make what I call a flow diagram of the argument. Here's what a flow diagram is. A flow diagram has statements that, I mean, you abbreviate the statements a lot so that you don't have to spend a ton of time writing, but statements in boxes or bubbles. And then what you do is you draw arrows to represent the logical flow of the passage. And then sometimes if you have transition words such as but, etc., between these boxes or bubbles. So let me give you a simpler example of what I mean by a flow diagram. This is definitely not a passage that is of the degree of formality you're going to see on the test, but it's something that it's kind of a nice bridge, because when we start attacking these things on the test, you'll be glad that we have done this sort of thing first. Okay. So here's what we mean. Here's a very sort of simple passage. If you say something like, my friend says that Dominican food isn't any good. However, he's wrong. I went to a Dominican restaurant last week, and it was great. All right, so this is a very simple passage, but this passage is meant for me to illustrate what I mean by a flow diagram. So what you do here is you put these, if you were diagramming this sort of passage, and if you can do this mentally, then that's great, although if the passage is long and convoluted, you may want to try to do it on paper. So here's the three statements. One statement is, friend, Dominican food is no good. So we'll make a box around that. And then the next statement is, friend is wrong. There's not supposed to be a slash there. Friend is wrong. And then the final statement is, last week, Dominican food was good. Okay, so one thing you're still going to have to do here is try to figure out what the main point of the argument is here. So, I mean, again, this is a warm-up. If you find this almost unconscionably easy, then that's a good thing. If you go ahead and tell me the text box, do you think the main point of this argument is that Dominican food is no good, or that it is actually good? In the text box. Go ahead and let me know. Okay, right. So what this is, and we'll still get some takeaways from this, but notice what this is. This is, I have a nickname for this. I'm not sure if you guys are all from America, so I don't know if you know how bowling works, but bowling is a sport. If any of you don't know, bowling is a game where you set a bunch of pins up at the end of an alley, and the goal of the game is to knock the pins down. So a bowling pin is basically something that you put up for the sole purpose of knocking it down. So in other words, this is a statement that is included specifically so that it can be knocked down. It's included precisely so that you can debunk it. Debunk meaning, we can knock it down, we can disprove it. And then this is a counter argument. So we're not going to have any arrows between this statement and that statement, because that wouldn't make any sense, right? I mean, this is not support for anything here, nor is anything here support for this. So instead, what you would put is you would put a large but between these two things. And then we've got to figure out which way the arrow goes here. All right, because the way the logical flow works is either this statement supports that one or that one supports this one. So go ahead and tell me in the text box, do you think statement 1 supports statement 2, or do you think statement 2 is used to support statement 1? Go ahead and tell me in the text box. Yeah, 2 supports 1. Okay, you guys are nailing this, so this is good. The arrow that you would put would be this way. If you need to, I mean, again, this is meant to be a very easy passage, but if you need to determine the direction of the arrow, then you can use a therefore test to determine the direction of the arrow. The way a therefore test works is you try it each way, and then you just sort of use your intuition to figure out which way it makes sense and which way it doesn't make sense. So if you try, my friend is wrong, therefore last week's Dominican food was good, that makes no sense at all. But if you say last week's Dominican food was good, therefore my friend is incorrect, there you go. So the advantage of a flow diagram is that it lets you figure out, it lets you identify as precisely as you can the role played by the statements in the passage. Because, I mean, the other type of diagram can be useful too, but the problem with the other type of diagram is that it's, number one, the T-bar diagram, where you put the pros on one side and the cons on the other side. The problem with that kind of diagram is that number one, all it really does is differentiate pros from cons. And once you figure that out, there's not a lot of resolution at the level of what pros are doing, what the cons are doing. I mean, so you're not going to figure out what is like evidence and what's a conclusion and what is, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other problem with a T-bar diagram here is that you have to already know what the conclusion is. So that can be an issue as well. Here, though, if you don't know what the conclusion is, this thing will tell you. Because the conclusion is whatever is at the end of the arrows. So if the arrow points to this statement, this must be the conclusion, and this must be evidence or support. So this is supporting consideration. All right. The question in the text box is a good question. This diagram, the point of this diagram is that it's specifically a good thing in terms of these questions, the argument structure questions. For other types of questions, the T-bar diagram is better. For instance, if you're doing strength and weaken, the T-bar is much better. Because if you're talking about strength and weaken is all about pros and cons. And, pros and cons are much more suited to a T-bar than to something like this. I mean, let's come back to this slide in a second. I mean, let me just talk about it's a little bit of digression, but it's a good point. Let me talk about the advantage of a T-bar versus regular diagram, or substitute versus a flow diagram. T-bar diagram, which is, if any of you don't know, if any of you haven't read our strategy guides, a T-bar diagram is the type of thing that has the conclusion on top, and then you put all the pros over on this side, and you put all the cons over on that side, versus a flow diagram where, the flow diagram is got all these box things going on where, you might have these arrows that are like, okay, here's an arrow, and then you might have two arrows pointing over here, and then maybe like this is some argument over there, and this is some counter argument. So, I mean, the advantage here Okay. The advantage of this diagram is it's usually easier to make, and it's probably more useful for passages on which the conclusion is already clear and you have to use pros and cons, such as strength and weaken. The advantage of this one, though, is that this diagram can actually tell you the structure of the argument. Like if you don't know where the conclusion of an argument is, then you can't make a T-bar because you don't know what goes on top of it. But in this diagram, it can tell you the structure, and it also tells you the roles played by the statements with greater clarity and detail. Clarity meaning that you can just look at the diagram. This is going to be the conclusion. This is support. This is the opposing conclusion. This is support for the opposing conclusion. The T-bar, you can't see all that right away. There's that, and then and also detail, meaning in this diagram it's beyond pro and con. You're not going to see a whole lot else. So it's going to depend on the problem type. Like if you're doing an analyze argument structure type problem, then this is going to be better because that's the whole point of this diagram, is to help you ascertain the structure. But if you're doing something like strength and weaken, most strength and weakens have conclusions that are pretty obvious. In fact, most of them are just like the conclusion is clearly stated at the end. So in that case, you don't so much need this. Instead, pros and cons are better. So smiley face if that answers your question, AJ. And smiley face if you guys, the rest of you out there, understand this. Give me smiley faces. Okay, so back to the matter at hand here. This is what a flow diagram looks like, and from that flow diagram, you have. I mean, this is a claim to be countered. This is my conclusion, and this is supporting evidence for that conclusion. All right, so once you do that, you can predict the role played by the statements in the passage. Smiley face if this makes sense. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to throw you guys into the pit, and we're just going to do a problem. Here's the way it's going to work. So if you notice, if any of you are watching your window, there's A through E choices that should have just appeared in the corner of the window. Okay, let's do this time. Everybody give me a smiley face if you see the A, B, C, D, and E buttons on the top of your window. Okay, good. I'm going to put a question on the screen, and do not type your answers in the text box, please. Instead, indicate your answers with those buttons that are up there. So other students that are here in the study hall won't be able to see your answers. That's the point of that. So, okay, let's go ahead and do this problem right here. I'll give you a time of about 2.5 minutes to work on this problem. When you're done, remember to use those buttons. Thanks. Okay, consider that a warning bell. For problems like this, which are very long and tedious, it's okay to go up to 3 minutes. So I'll give you another 30 seconds on the clock. But make sure everybody answers it by then, please. Okay, we've got a couple of participants that don't have answers indicated. So if you are one of those, please indicate some sort of answer, please. Okay, so time's up here. Here are your results. So as you can see, we are absolutely all over the place on this one. Let's take a look. And then, because this is a difficult type of problem, as we said in the beginning of the class, we're going to talk about a backup method where even if you don't understand the argument, you'll be able to classify statements. But that'll be coming in a little bit. Let's go ahead and take a look. I'll show you, by the way, flow diagrams, if any of you made them. Flow diagrams are certainly not always going to be the same. I mean, my flow diagram might not look exactly like yours, but at the same time, if you're evaluating the same argument, there should be at least a superficial degree of similarity. So, okay, here's the question at hand. Now again, you definitely want to abbreviate these things when you make a flow diagram, because otherwise time management is going to be a serious issue. So basically the first finding, you don't have to be super quantitative with it, just say people report whiplash more in countries when they'll be paid for whiplash. All right, that's that first claim. It's not a claim, actually. That's that first statement. Presently, no objective test for whiplash exists, so it is true that spurious reports of whiplash injuries cannot be readily identified. So, no way of telling real from fake whiplash claims. By the way, it helps to rephrase these things into your own words when you're doing this sort of flow diagram. Indicate that here on the screen. It helps to rephrase statements into your own words. Because actually there have been studies that have shown that, that rephrasing things helps comprehension. They've done these PET scans, which are those scans that actually show brain activity on the screen. And PET scans of people who are copying things show that their brains pretty much shut down while they copy things. It's actually really interesting. Like you can't copy and think at the same time. So if you reword these things so that you can improve your understanding, you may find that that helps. Commentators, this is actually two kinds of statements. The facts don't warrant the conclusion drawn by some commentators that. So that's really two things. Let's untangle them. Commentators say that half of the whiplash claims. Commentators say half of whiplash claims in these countries are fake. And then the argument says commentators are wrong. Claims do not warrant, the facts do not warrant the commentator's claim. That's a fancy way of saying the commentators are incorrect. And then in these countries, same countries, different countries where they don't compensate for whiplash, people often have little incentive to report whiplash injuries. So in the other countries, people will underreport whiplash. Okay, so I'll give you an idea of how this argument is structured. The commentators say that, text box question I'll get to you in a little bit. The commentators say that they claim that one half of these countries are fake. One half of these claims are fake. There's twice as many claims in these countries. That's the basis for the commentators saying that. And on top of that, there's no way of telling real claims from whiplash claims. But the commentators are incorrect about that. So this stuff is a counter argument. So that's a but. And then if we use a therefore test here, the commentators are wrong, therefore in other countries people will underreport whiplash. No. In other countries people will underreport whiplash, therefore the commentators are wrong. So that's this way. And by the way, this, if you want to, you could draw something like a dotted line from here to here as well, because this fact is also accounted for over here. In other words, the commentators are just looking at this. There's a lot more claims when people are paid. Therefore, a lot of them are fake. We are saying, yes, there are a lot more claims where people will get paid, but there are also a lot fewer real claims when people are not paid. So these two facts in tandem lead us to conclude the commentators are wrong. This fact alone leads the commentators to conclude that. Does this make at least some sense, smiley face, if you follow what we have here on the screen? Okay, so we got some smileys. You can give me the other face if you don't follow. The face that's underneath the smiley, just so I can get a poll here of how we're doing with this. Okay, none of the one or two of the other face. Okay, the smileys seem to outnumber the non-smileys by about 8 or 9 to 1, so I think we'll proceed. Remember, for those of you non-smiley people, there is going to be another method that we're going to present you with shortly, which actually doesn't even require comprehension of the argument. So that's going to be a good thing. Okay, well, so what are these bold faces? The first bold face is this one right here. People report whiplash more often. And then the second bold face is this one. So that's number 1 boldface, and that's number 2 boldface. Well, so notice number 1 is a boldface that's used in their argument and also in mine. And so number 1 is just a statistical fact. Number 1 is a statistical fact that is used in different ways by the commentators and by me and by the argument. Number 2 is evidence that only is used for my argument. Number 2 is support for my argument against the commentators, and it's not used by the commentators. So if you go through these choices looking for statements that are similar to these, then, okay, the first is a claim that the argument disputes that it doesn't. I mean, this is taken as fact by me and by the other person. It's a fact that's used by both of us. Claim that's used to support a conclusion that the argument accepts. Well, not really. It's a claim that is mostly used to advance the commentator's claim, which we are absolutely rejecting. So, and it's not really in keeping with this. The first is evidence that has been used to support a conclusion for which the argument provides further evidence. The second is the main conclusion of the argument. Well, second's not a conclusion of anything. The second is support for this conclusion. So that's another reason to rule out B and C, because the second is not a conclusion. The second is support for this conclusion. D, the first is a finding whose implications are at issue. That seems to fit because at issue means we're arguing about what it means. Well, they use it to support this, I use it to support that. So that's true. And then the second is presented in order to argue against deriving certain implications. Okay, this is used to support my argument against that argument. So that's pretty good. The first is a finding whose accuracy is evaluated, except it's not. The argument never says that this claim is inaccurate. Inaccurate would mean we were actually saying these statistics were wrong, maybe because of the way that they were presented or whatever, or the way the surveys were conducted or something like that. But the argument doesn't do that. So, okay. The best thing in concert with what we've said here is choice D. Choice D of these 5 agrees the most with what we wrote here. Does this make at least some sense? Smiley face, if it does. And again, remember that we are, okay, I count a fair number of smiley faces. That's good. Count at least 15 smiley faces. That's what I like. Remember that we're going to have a backup method which has a much lower standard of comprehension here. So, okay, the questions that are in the text box, one user is writing about trouble creating notes. I think you guys can see each other's questions in the text box. Unfortunately, that's not something with an easy fix, because what you have to do is you have to strike a balance between writing enough for you to remember what's going on and writing too much. And so you've got to budget time accordingly. You know, if you can't read your own handwriting, I think honestly the best way to fix that is just to write a little bit more slowly. Like if you write at maybe 75% of your current writing speed, you won't realistically take that much more time, but you'll probably have better ability to read it. But practice is required. I mean, even problems that aren't boldfaces, like if you need practice at this strict note-taking version, you can always do, yeah, the answer is D. D like dog. Because D is the one that's most like what we've written here. E is not correct because we never said the finding was inaccurate. Writing in caps, I probably wouldn't, unless you normally write in caps all the time, that's probably not a great idea, because writing in caps is usually half the speed or less of writing in normal handwriting. Especially if you're not used to writing in caps. It can be really, really, really slow. If you guys are draftsmen or some engineers or law enforcement people who write in caps all the time at work, then that might work, but otherwise, probably not a good idea. Okay, so I mean, AJ, that's probably about the best I can tell you is that you can go practice this on other passages. You can go take passages that are not boldfaces and still see if you can make flow diagrams with appropriate abbreviations and see how well you can do with time. To the question, why isn't it the main conclusion? It's because it's not a conclusion. Remember we used a therefore test, and we decided that this supports this, because these two are my argument. We used a therefore test. In other countries, people underreport whiplash, therefore the commentators are wrong. That makes sense. The commentators are wrong, therefore other people will underreport whiplash. That doesn't make sense. People aren't going to change their behavior based on what commentators say. So this is not a conclusion of anything. So therefore it can't be the main conclusion. This is actually support offered for that conclusion. Give me a smiley face if that makes sense. Particularly the one who asked that question about the second one being the conclusion or not. If you understand, then give me the smiley. Okay, good. All right, so what I want to do now, let's revisit the following words in the answer choices. Give me a smiley face if you guys can see the words that I'm starting to highlight. Can you guys see these words? So far in blue, I've highlighted claim, claim, evidence, finding, and finding. Okay. You guys are going to like this. You guys are going to like this a lot, actually. So those, let's talk about those. In particular, let me point to this word right here, evidence. Can somebody tell me something about evidence? Like, what is the only kind of thing that can be evidence? I know that's kind of a vague question, but we'll see if anybody sees where we're going with this. Facts. There you go. Yeah, someone put data and stats. It doesn't have to be a statistic. I mean, if you, like, for example, this guy has blood on his hands is not a statistic, but that could be evidence for having committed some crime, you know. But, okay, so, right, evidence actually has to be facts. This kind of observation is the basis for what we're going to call this backup method. So here's the backup method for evaluating boldface problems. Don't worry about the problem disappearing. We'll come back to it in a second. Backup method for evaluating boldface problems. Take each boldface and decide whether each boldface is a fact or a claim. This you can do even if you have absolutely zero understanding of what is going on in the passage. Like, even if you do not have a clue what the passage is talking about, you can still do this. You can still decide whether boldfaces are facts or claims. All right. In most cases, this will be easy. All right. For example, if you say something like the unemployment rate in, if you say something like the unemployment rate in January was twice the rate last May. Okay, that is very clearly a fact. But if you say something like, you know, the observer's prediction will turn out to be wrong, I mean, that's definitely a claim. But on the other hand, some cases, some statements could go either way. Okay, for instance, if you say something like, some statements can be either. If I say something like the patrons of this restaurant have more, are extremely wealthy. That one could actually be either way. It depends on how we know it. Like, if we know this because we actually know how much money those people have, then that's a fact. But if we know this, if we claim that we know this because they drive up in expensive cars or because they order $500 bottles of wine or something like that at the restaurant, then that could be a claim. So in this case, generally, for statements like these, like this one, which could potentially be either facts or claims, the presence of qualifiers A claim is something that's not a solid fact. A claim is an argument that we're making. It could be falsified. It's like a hypothesis. You know, it is. The question in the text box is whether claims are like inferences. The problem with answering that question is that this is the GMAT, and the word inference in the GMAT doesn't mean what the word inference means in the real world. In the real world, inferences are absolutely claims, absolutely. But on the GMAT, the word inference doesn't mean what it means in the real world. On the GMAT, the word inference means prove more facts from these facts. So, unfortunately, no, GMAT inferences are generally not claims. So, but they're not going to, I don't think they're going to use the word inference on these boldface questions for probably that exact reason. But back to this, the way to tell whether these are either fact or claims, the presence of qualifiers indicates a claim. What I mean by qualifiers is statements that qualify the original statement. Examples of qualifiers include clearly, or certainly, or must be, or probably. I mean, anything using qualifiers like this has to be a claim, because if it were just factual, then you wouldn't need the qualifiers. Okay, so sorry for that brief delay. Like, here's an example. So if you go back to this up here, if you just say the patrons of this restaurant are extremely wealthy, that's probably a fact, because if you just declare that, then there must be some solid evidence for that. But if you have a passage that says the patrons of this restaurant must be extremely wealthy, that's a claim, because they're going to be making that claim based on observations. Like, if you say must be, that means you're seeing the cars they drive, or you're seeing the food or wine they buy, and you're inferring that they must be wealthy. So, okay, give me a smiley face if you guys understand, A, the distinction between claim and fact, and B, how to tell, especially in borderline cases like this. Okay, so the question in the text box is exactly what we're hitting at next here. Why would you want to do this? Well, because remember, yeah, modifiers is a sentence correction issue, so that's not really what we're talking about. But, I mean, yeah, those things usually are grammatically modifiers, although that's not so much the point. The point is just that they qualify the statement, and so they make a claim. But, okay, so once you do that, look at indicator words in the answer choices that restrict those choices to facts or claims. All right, for instance, one restriction we've already seen is that if you say evidence, evidence has to be fact. Okay, if a statement makes a claim, then it is absolutely not evidence. So this is powerful, because even if you don't understand, even if you don't understand the argument at all, if you can distinguish facts from claims, then you can eliminate a lot of choices anyway. So, all right. Must be facts, must be claims, can be either. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and involve you guys as an audience in this. I'm going to give you a bunch of words out loud. Okay, so evidence we've already established has to be facts. All right, so evidence we'll go ahead and put in that first column. All right, I'm going to toss out some words in the text box. Give me an F if it has to be a claim, a C if it has to, sorry, an F if it has to be a fact, a C if it has to be a claim, or an E if it could be either one. Okay, I'll toss out some words for you. Circumstance. What do you guys think? You think a circumstance would have to be a fact, a claim, or either? Okay, that one's tough. Yeah, John 1's got it. A circumstance has to be fact. Because if you think about a circumstance, think about something using circumstance. Like, what were the circumstances under which this crime occurred? Generally, in circumstances means like, what was the time of day? What was the temperature like? Was it dark outside? Was it wet? Was it rainy? Was the person running? Was the person screaming? Those are circumstances. Those are facts. So a circumstance is just some sort of background condition, which is factual. So that's a tough one. What about a judgment? C, F, or E? A judgment. Okay. A judgment is definitely a claim because you have to be judging something. A judgment basically means some sort of opinion that you're passing on something. Like, judgments are things like, this statement is not justified, this action is misguided, this thing will not achieve its goal. It's judgment. It's not a fact. It's something that it's like your take or your opinion on something. What about a conclusion? C, F, or E? Yeah, okay. This one, in these arguments, I'm going to give you guys an asterisk here. Because what the asterisk means is, in their arguments, conclusions are always claims. Always, always, always. On the other hand, the reason why there's an asterisk is because, however, if they ask you to draw a conclusion of your own, your conclusion should be a fact that you can prove from the existing facts. These are very different. We can touch on this in probably a future study hall if we need to. But when you analyze their arguments, their conclusions have to be factual. Otherwise, you can't call them conclusion. Because the idea is that, they need an argument in the first place. So make sure you're aware of this. This is very important. Conclusions have to be claims. Okay, what about a consideration? I'm giving you guys all the tough ones first. So a consideration can be either one. Because a consideration is just something that you consider in making an argument. So, basically that's everything. You might consider things that are facts, but you might consider claims as well. So considerations can be either. Okay. Let me give you a couple more. Findings have to be facts. Data, observations, information, that's another big one. Information is always facts. Okay, claims are not information. So, okay, there you go. So, and then of course, if it says fact, they might even just say that. Here are some more things that have to be claims. A position has to be a claim. A stance has to be a claim. A prediction has to be a claim because there's no way you can know if a prediction has to be true. A hypothesis has to be a claim. A belief has to be a claim. Okay. And then as far as things that can be either, explanations can be either because, you can use facts or claims to explain stuff. Justification is absolutely whatever you use to justify your conclusion, so that can be fact and claim. And then support. The key here, though, is these. By the way, in this list also should be objection. Objections are generally claims. Okay. if you see these words, then you can just, even if you do not understand the argument at all, you can still match these words against the content of the argument and against the content of the answer choices. And if it doesn't match, it's the wrong answer. It's kind of neat. So let's take a look at that problem yet again, but in view of this. So again, let's go ahead and highlight this stuff. So here's claim, claim, evidence, finding, finding. And then the second is a conclusion. The second is a conclusion. The second is the conclusion. The second is a claim. And the second is evidence. Okay. So let's take a look. Well, the first boldface, in countries where insurance includes compensation for whiplash, reports of whiplash are twice as frequent as they are in other countries. Okay, notice this is a precise statistic. So if boldface 1 is a fact, say fact in the text box. And if boldface 1 is a claim, then say claim in the text box. Or F or C. Okay, yeah, this is definitely a fact. All right, so because it's a precise statistic. All right, on the other hand, number 2, in particular, notice this qualifier. And notice this statement about incentive. Incentive is, what are people's reasons for doing something. Clearly, people don't have much of a reason to do this. Is that a fact or is that a claim? That one's a claim, especially in view of this qualifier. Like if you need to say clearly, certainly, must, whatever, that means that these are not facts because you don't need to say things like that with facts. Like, think about that for a second. Words like clearly and must and certainly, they have no place when you present facts. Like you would never say clearly the unemployment rate is twice what it was last month. It doesn't make any sense. Instead, you would say something like, clearly the unemployment rate is what it was. You would say the unemployment rate is twice what it was. You just state the fact. Then you would say clearly, and then your conclusion from that, your claim. Clearly the economy is getting worse. There's your claim. So number 2 is a claim. Note the qualifier. Note that you don't have to have any understanding of the argument to do this. You don't have to understand a thing about the argument, about the way it works. Well, let's take a look. Number 1 is a fact. Claim, wrong. Claim, wrong. Evidence is fact, so that's fine. Findings are fact, so that's fine. Findings are fact, so that's fine. So based on this rather humble observation, we've already eliminated 2 choices. A is gone, and B is gone. Because number 1 has to be a fact. Number 2 has to be a claim. Well, evidence is not a claim. Evidence would have to be a fact, and this is not a fact. So we can rule out E as well. Okay, now this procedure definitely has its limits. For instance, C and D both pass these 2 tests. Evidence would be a fact, and concluding would be a claim. Finding would be a fact, and of course, claim is a claim. So we can't really get past C versus D, but that's pretty darn good. Because if you look at how many answers there were that were not C or D, there were a lot of them. So this is a pretty awesome method. So you decide whether each boldface is factual or whether it's a claim. And then you look for indicator words. that restrict your choice accordingly. And then when you find those, then eliminate accordingly. Believe it or not, there are some problems. They're in the official guide, so we didn't reproduce them here. By the way, if any of you guys are official guide veterans, this problem is in the official guide, but the reason we're allowed to use it is because it has also been used on GMAT prep software. So any problems that are unique to the official guide, we can't use. There are a couple problems in the official guide, Boldface, that you can solve completely using just this, because there's only one choice that passes this test. It's pretty sweet. So, okay. Any questions here? All right, let's try another one. See how you do. Try that. I'll give you another timer, about 2:40 or something. And I'll clear out, okay, I've cleared out your answers. Again, don't indicate answers in the text box. Please indicate them with the buttons that are on top. Thank you. Okay, I see one question saying the screen is blank. If you guys can see this question, give me a smiley face. I mean, I would hope that people would have objected by now if you couldn't see the question. Okay, for the one user whose screen is blank, I can try to reload real quick. There's a reload. Yeah. Otherwise, if I don't know what the problem is. So, okay, I'll try to get, there's still a lot of you without answers, so I'll give you another 20 seconds or so to produce an answer. Go for it. Okay, guys, it's time to cut the rope and pick an answer. Again, this is not, these aren't easy. So, let's see, at least there are two choices that you can get down to if you just use this previous method that we looked at. So here are your statistics. So it looks like most of you are picking B and E. Well, let's do our elimination method here first. So here's the problem again. Let's take a look. Boldface number one, the fragments themselves almost certainly contain no sulfur. See if that's a claim, and F if that's a fact. First boldface. All right. So that is a claim because, again, it has a qualifier on it. You wouldn't present facts with almost certainly. You know, make sure you guys know this. Just again, think about this in real life. Think about when you would say almost certainly. You would only say that when you don't factually know something. For example, if I say something like, this guy who comes to my restaurant is almost certainly rich. Think about when I would say something like that. I would say something like that if I really don't know one way or the other how much money this person had. But if I just witness their behavior and they're like walking around spending tons of money. So I would not say this person is almost certainly rich if I could see their tax return and see how much money they made. Because that would make no sense. I would either just say this person is rich or this person is not rich. So remember what we said about these qualifiers. You know, I'll find you this slide with where I wrote that again. But when you have fact versus claim, 3 screens ago, remember the presence of qualifiers indicates a claim. Okay, guys, if you see clearly or certainly or must be or probably, those are not facts. Just make sure you learn that, because facts don't have to be presented with this kind of dressing on them. I mean, especially not certain, especially not almost or probably or could be. I mean, not only are things like this not facts, they actually can't be facts. Because almost certainly, by definition, means it's not certain. Okay, the reason I'm going off on this is because a lot of people wrote fact. That's not a fact. So number one is a claim. Note, qualifier. Almost certainly. Okay, give me a smiley face if that makes sense to you guys. All right, pretty solid. I'm especially looking for smileys from people who put fact, because that is not a fact. Okay, number two, C if that's a claim, F if it's a fact. It is likely that some of the fragments were at least large enough to have passed through Jupiter's outer atmosphere without being burned up. C for claim, F for fact. Okay, nicely done, guys. This is definitely a claim. Two is also a claim. Note there's a qualifier again. Qualifier is it is likely. Again, fact, it would make no sense to say it's likely or not likely. I mean, if something is a fact, it's either true or it's false. So there's no such thing as likelihood unless it's a claim. So we're going to highlight in green anything that indicates facts, because anything saying either of these things is a fact is automatically incorrect. In green is words that are restricted to facts and are therefore wrong for both of these boldfaces. Well, okay. So, tell you what, let's put this out to you guys. Do you see any words in these answer choices that have to be facts? If you do, go ahead and type them into the text box. Yeah, evidence. Evidence is in there twice. There's evidence and there's evidence. And then there is conclusions are claims, guys. Remember we went over this. Which slide is that on? That is on this slide. Conclusions are not facts. Okay, remember the entire reason that you have an argument in the first place is because conclusions are not facts. In other words, if you had an argument whose conclusion was factual, you would not need an argument in the first place. Okay? In the arguments that they supply you with, conclusions are always, always, always claims. The only time conclusions are facts is in draw the conclusion problems. But that means they're just not giving you an argument in the first place. In these problems, the conclusion will always, always be a claim. I'm sure you guys know that. So, okay, here's the problem at hand. Evidence has to be a fact, and circumstances are facts. So, those answer choices are all gone. That means that even if you don't understand what's going on in this argument, because notice we have done zero analysis of this argument so far. We haven't looked at a darn thing yet. All we've said is the first statement is a claim and the second statement is a claim, which are things that you can just tell from looking at them. You don't even have to analyze the argument to figure that out. So we're down to B and E. Now to choose between B and E, you have to at least figure out what the relationship is between these two statements. But B, just so that we can move on to the other topic at hand, I'd like to give the formal treatment. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Here's the refresh screen. We can eliminate these three choices which have words that indicate facts. To get between B and E, without going completely into a flow diagram here, I guess we could go into a flow diagram. That would mean that would generally mean that we're going to have to put the rate time distance off till next time, which we probably should anyway. We only have about 17 minutes left, so that's not really enough time for rate time distance. So we'll do that on the 29th. Let's do the flow diagram for this. So let's copy this question. So one of the users wrote, when does, I think that's supposed to say conclusion. When are conclusions facts? Remember, not on these, okay? When you draw conclusions, when you're doing a draw the conclusion type question, which is a totally different type of CR question, then the conclusion has to be a fact, but only then. So if it's your job to draw the conclusion, your conclusion must be factual. When they present you with an argument containing a conclusion, the conclusion must be a claim. All right, so let's grab this and take it to the next screen. Let me show you a flow diagram for this problem. So remember, you want to abbreviate. So if you try to put all this stuff into a flow diagram, it's going to kill you. So observations showed the comet broke into fragments, but did not show how big the fragments were. So paraphrase, we know that there's fragments, don't know size of fragments. In 1994. Okay, so that's a statement. In hopes of gaining some indication of the fragment size, notice that there's, I mean, some of this also is keeping your eyes open for themes here. Because these passages are very strongly run through with themes. Like if they keep mentioning some topic over and over and over and over again, then it's very likely that that topic is going to be the essence of the conclusion. So notice this is already two mentions of the size of the fragments. We don't know how big, we didn't originally know how big they are. Hopes of gaining some indication of how big they are. So we know this is important. Like, we know that we want something to do with how big these fragments are. So you might want to just file that away in your mental register here. But in hopes of gaining some indication of the fragment size, they studied spectrographic analyses. Okay, I mean, they did studies to try to find size of the fragment. Okay, they found sulfur. Fragments didn't contain sulfur. But many astronomers believe that the cloud layer does. Clouds on Jupiter do contain sulfur. And again, you abbreviate these in whatever way you can. Since sulfur would have seeped into the outer atmosphere if comet fragments had penetrated this cloud layer, it is likely that some of the fragments were at least large enough to have passed Jupiter's outer atmosphere. Okay. When they say since sulfur would have seeped into, that means, among other things, that sulfur did not seep out there. So the sulfur stayed away from the outer atmosphere. The sulfur stayed inside. So sulfur didn't, the sulfur was in the atmosphere. Sulfur penetrated outer atmosphere. That's where they set that up here. The analysis revealed traces of sulfur in the outer atmosphere. In fact, these are basically the same statement. This one right here. This one right here. So we actually don't need that one anymore. Therefore, the comet's fragments must have been big enough to pass through the atmosphere. So what are the connections here? Well, the way this works, these are just background facts. All right? These aren't going to be, this is not an argument. Instead, it's more like, here's what they found. So here's what they found. So this is background, all of this. There were no sulfur in the fragments, but sulfur penetrated from the clouds to the outer atmosphere. So this is a but. As it says, but many astronomers believe. So these in combination are meant to show you that the fragments must have penetrated the atmosphere. This is, if you need to, you can do a therefore test to figure this out. Fragments must have penetrated the atmosphere, therefore these things are true. That can't work, because these are direct findings of the experiment. So it must be the other way around. They found these things, therefore fragments must have penetrated the atmosphere. Now, this is an extremely difficult passage to follow, but notice there's a pattern here, and this does follow the usual pattern of scientific reasoning. So if they describe a scientific experiment, notice you've got findings of the experiment. Therefore, they make a hypothesis. So even if you don't really understand what's going on here, believe me, I feel you on that. This is a very hard thing to understand. Probably the optimal way to approach this, again, is to do this, because you can kill these three choices very, very, very quickly. But if you do want to try to make the flow, it helps to understand that these guys are talking about a scientific experiment. When you talk about scientific experiments, almost always it's, here's the background, here's what they found, therefore, here's their hypothesis. It doesn't make sense to say, here's their hypothesis, therefore, here's what they found. I mean, that doesn't work. Because that's not how scientific experiments work. You don't make a hypothesis before you see any data. A theory. You don't come up with your explanation before you've seen anything. So you want to call it a hypothesis, you can call it a theory, same sort of thing. But it's based on what they saw. Let me move that up and write that. Okay, but again, this is hard. If you can do this, I mean, I think my main pitch today is to try to pitch this method to you instead. Because you don't have to worry about any of this. This is just crazy. I mean, if you guys don't figure this out relatively quickly, the chances of figuring it out in a very short time are kind of small. So instead, what you can do is just do this. So again, the order of, one of the users asked earlier, how do I know when to do which one? I would say if you get confused, you should very quickly switch over to using this method. And that's what you should do. Because this method is a lot lower octane. You don't have to try as hard here. And it takes less time as well. So you can also use it to answer these otherwise intimidating questions much more quickly. All right. Because here's the thing. Like if you get down to these two, all you really have to do is decide whether these work with each other or against each other. So that's still not easy. But notice in B it says the second they're opposed to each other. It weighs against the conclusion, and the second is the conclusion. Whereas E says advance and support, and that's the conclusion. So if you even have a vague idea whether these support or oppose each other, in this case they support, then you can pick between B and E. But at least you can get rid of 3 choices with extremely minimal effort. And that's the main thrust of today. I mean, you can't necessarily expect to get everything all the time. But note that we got rid of 3 choices with comparatively little effort. And this technique is fast. So that's a good thing. Okay, there's a question in the text box. The question says, do you recommend, it looks like paraphrasing for the diagram, or straight up abbreviate while you read? That's a good question, and if there were a total diagnosis, of course, we would be much richer than we are. But I think a good way to think about paraphrasing is to think about it as, a good way to think about paraphrasing is like, how would I explain this out loud? Without sounding like you were reading a book. Because, I mean, we go over the sentence correction, there's a huge difference between out loud and written language. And so if you force yourself to translate statements like this into out loud language, then a lot of the time you're going to be able to figure this out, or at least how to paraphrase it. For instance, the way we did this problem, nobody out loud would say, in countries where automobile insurance includes compensation for whiplash injuries, sustained automobile accidents, reports of having some injuries just quite speaking as they are in countries where whiplash is not covered. Deep breath. No one's going to say that out loud. It's not going to happen. But what this means, if you explain it out loud to somebody, is when you pay people for whiplash, then people start reporting whiplash more. That makes sense out loud. So, I mean, that's the rule that I use for paraphrasing, is give me something that would make sense if you said it out loud. And honestly, there's a certain dose of brutal honesty that's required here. If you can't do that, then that pretty much means you don't really understand the argument. And so in the case of a problem like this, like if you have to repeat literally the words that are on the page, then that means you don't understand the argument. Unfortunately, that's what it means. So, and then that doesn't mean you're lost, right? I mean, if you absolutely can't do this, i.e. you're stuck with literal reading of the exact words that are there, then you got to be honest with yourself. This means that you don't really understand, or don't understand at all. what the passage is saying. That will happen. I mean, you know, the whole point of boldface question is to be hard to understand. I mean, that's why those questions are there. I mean, they are questions where the challenge is in understanding what is going on in the first place. So they're not going to be easy. Because remember, as soon as you figure out what's happening, you're done. It's not like you have to find an assumption or weaken these or anything. As soon as you figure out what they are saying, you're done. But that's why they're hard. If that happens, where you just don't get it, just move on to the backup method, which is fact versus claim, which is something that you can still utilize even if you don't understand the logical flow. There it is. And as you've seen on this problem right here, it can really be a beautiful thing. I mean, you can get this down to you can get this one down to 2 choices, and you can also get this one down to 2 choices. So yeah. Someone asked, why is A not correct? A is not correct because this is actually the entire conclusion of the argument. So this is not part of an explanation for something else. This other stuff is the explanation for this hypothesis, for this theory. So this one's got it backwards. The choice A says that this is explaining this, but it's not true. The other stuff is actually providing reasons for that. Okay, that brings us pretty much notes screen. By notes screen, do you mean that one? Which notes screen? Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of words here, but basically it's a 2-tiered process. It's basically try to understand it, and if you don't understand it, go with the backup method. So that's pretty much where we're at. Like, again, let me take you back to our initial notes screen here. It's basically, note that we listed this as a backup method. That's because it's what it is. All right, so way back to the beginning of the lesson right here. Number 1, the ideal approach. If the ideal approach, remember the ideal approach is ideal. You're not always going to be able to do it. If you can't, like if you don't have a sufficient understanding of the passage to make this work, then you have to do the backup method. That's why it's the backup method. So there it is. Okay. Question, we need to wrap this pretty soon, by the way, guys. Time is up, but I'll take this question in the text box if you have any other quick ones. It says, when the boldface is part of a sentence, should we take into consideration the whole sentence or just the boldface? Absolutely just the boldface. No question about it. To this question, the answer was E, because here's our diagram. This is the main conclusion. This theory is what all of these findings are meant to justify. So it's all of this stuff, blah, 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 blah. Therefore, the fragments must have been big enough to pass through the outer atmosphere. Notice again, there's a connecting theme. I'll come back to that question, Cheryl, in a second. Don't underestimate the importance of connecting themes. Right? Like what I mean by connecting themes are themes that run through the rest of the passage here. Like they're talking about we didn't know how big they were. In hopes of finding out how big they were, here's what they did. So if you look at this, in this setup, I mean, this is not an easy thing to understand, but it should be at least clear from these highlighted parts that they were really, really interested in finding out how big these things are. So in that case, it's very likely that our main conclusion will have something to do with how big they are. And indeed, here it does. So if you are guessing, that could help guide your guessing. Like, wow, I'm really interested in how big these things are. I don't really care if they have sulfur, because they don't talk about sulfur up here. But they were like, they really wanted to know how big they were. Aha, here's how big they were. So Tammy, that'll probably help you figure out which one is the conclusion. Smiley, if that makes sense. Still doesn't make it super easy, but there you go. Back to this screen that's right here. Cheryl, yeah, when you look at boldfaces, you definitely have to look at just the fragment of the sentence that is boldfaced. So, because a lot of the time, if you've got more than one, if you've got a sentence with multiple parts, then they're going to work against each other. Like if you look at this sentence, the fragments that contain no sulfur, but many astronomers believe that blah, 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 blah. So these things, you know, the relationships here aren't going to be simple. And it's the relationship between these two parts that will contribute, but you're only caring about this one part. So when they, and indeed, some boldfaces, like here's a question that we didn't get the chance to review. But Cheryl, this will prove to you that you really don't want to. This, by the way, is in GMAT prep software, and you can search for, if you want to find this question, you can search for Burton Tool on our Manhattan GMAT forums, and it'll come up. But notice Cheryl, who asked about, do you want to look at just the boldface fragment? Absolutely, because notice this sentence here. It is doubtful, I mean, the investor said blah, 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 but in this case, it is clearly not justified. So you're just talking about the fact that it's not justified, whatever this investor said. If you want further details, you can look this question up on the forum, and there it is. Okay, let's wrap this up. We're about 5-6 minutes over. And yeah, okay, here's what we can do, okay? I'll send you guys an email address in the text box. Now, there's a certain rule of common courtesy here, and I feel the need to articulate this because there's always that one person who wants to send like 15 questions a week via email, and for most of you, you don't really have to be told that that's not okay, but so, you know, pardon me for sort of legislating common sense here, but I'll give my email address out. There's my email address. It's in the text box, ronp@manhattangmat.com. When you email, remember that there are like 70 people signed up for the study hall. So, you know, there's and usually between 30 and 40 actually attend. Like right now we have about 30 people here. So when you send emails, try to imagine 30 other people sending the same amount of email. And if that would be absolutely overwhelming, then that's an indicator of something. Like in other words, if you have tons and tons and tons of questions, then you should probably take those to either the forum or tutoring hours, one of the two, depending on how specific your questions are. So the forum, that's what the forums are for. But if you guys do have the occasional private question, then feel free to email. Just make sure that you don't send so many that if everybody else did the same, it would be ridiculous. So that's all. Smiley face if that makes sense. Again, it doesn't mean don't send questions. It just means that if you have tons of them, then put them on the forum. Okay. Also, the other thing is this. Let me go ahead and type this on here. And here's the deal. Okay, the forums are at manhattangmat.com/forums. Okay, if you have questions about specific problems or individual study plans, you know, that kind of thing. In fact, most questions, this is where you should take those questions. Okay, for specific problems, we have lots and lots and lots of different folders. I mean, we have math and verbal folders. There's different folders for GMAT prep official problems, our own problems, and then other problems from other sources. So the reason being, if you just send a private email, then only you can see the answer to it. But if you're asking about a problem, then you would rather post something that 1,000 other people can see also, because that's what the forums are for. Same thing with individual study plans. Individual study plans are best posted in what are called the general folders. We have what's called a general folder. If you don't know exactly what I mean by this, go to the general folder and read through the stuff that's in there. We are usually very good at getting back to people on this stuff quickly. So especially general folder. General folder, you will get an answer in like 2-3 days max. Sometimes these folders, it takes a little bit longer, a couple weeks, something like that. But there it is. So there aren't really that many questions that really merit personal email, because most questions are things that the answers would benefit everybody else. In fact, that's a good rule to use. If the answer to your question would also benefit other students, please post the question on the forum rather than sending it through a personal email. Okay, and that goes for very much the majority of things that you could send. So, okay, we're going to close this out pretty soon. The recording is now over.